Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to our program. If you have a Bible or Bible app, go ahead and open up with me. Turn over to Psalm 13. We're going to be in Psalm 13. We're going to study through it, and then we're going to set this up so that we can meditate on it. We can think deeply. We can ruminate on it as we go throughout the rest of our day. Put it in our hearts so that we can become servants of God, so that we can become like a man after God's own heart, as we're going to see in Psalm 13 here. And so let me ask you a question. I've been thinking a lot about this as we're doing this, or before I did this psalm, and I was thinking, have you ever felt like God is distant? I'd say that most of us had probably had a moment in our lives. If we've been here long enough, we've had a moment in our life when we felt that way. And if we felt that way, then we're in pretty good company. A man after God's own heart felt that way multiple times. And we're going to see that right here in Psalm 13. In fact, there's several different people in the Bible where that just seems like the case. We'll talk about those here in a little bit, but David's going to describe all of that in Psalm 13. And despite his constant prayers, it seems like God's unavailable. So I wanted you to consider just a couple things about this psalm before we get into it. There are three verses or three stanzas, two verses apiece. Number one, we're going to see the problem. Then you're going to see David's petition, and then you're going to see David's praise. And so let's get into the psalm here. Let's begin with the problem that's going on here. Look at verses 1 and 2. In verse 1, he says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long will my enemies be exalted over me?" Can you see the song? Can you see the theme of this psalm? How long, how long, how long, how long? And so how does David feel? How does he feel here? He feels like it's going to last a long time. I think that's the hardest part. It's not always about the intensity or the intensity of the suffering. Sometimes it's about the duration of the suffering. You think about it with Job. Job seemed like he did really well when everything hit. I mean, he lost his oxen, his donkey, his sheep, his camels, his servants, his children, his health, his wife's foolishness. But Job, where Job seemed to struggle was when it just seemed like it was lasting forever and ever and ever. And it just wore him down. He struggled. He doubted. He even accused God of some things, even though he repented of that. And that's what makes, though, it so difficult. It's like David can't see the end of the tunnel here. And so the question of how long is a very common question in the Bible, because you got David multiple times. You got Job asked that question. Asaph asked that question in Psalm 74. You got Habakkuk in Habakkuk 1. The souls of the martyrs under the altar in Revelation 6. And then look at the last part of verse 1. He says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" Doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense, but David is talking about how he feels. He feels like it's been forever. He feels like the suffering just would never end. It'd go on and on forever. And he's struggling even to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Have you ever felt like something that enters into your life just like will never end? And think about it. That happens for a lot of multiple struggles, like bad marriages people are in. How long are you going to let me be with this fool? Or unfaithful children? How long are you going to let them go off and do what they want to do instead of actually having them come back to you? Bad family situations. How long is my family going to fight and feud, and I'm going to feel like an outcast? There's a lot of issues where we feel this way. Then he goes on to say in verse 2, he says, "How long will you hide your face from me?" David is struggling because he felt like God is not there. When things are really bad, the hardest part is when God doesn't seem like he cares, or where God just seems absent from the whole thing. Have you felt that way? Like God's far away. You pray, but it feels like God's not listening to you. You study, but it feels like God's not really talking to you. You seek God, but it feels like he's hiding behind some wall somewhere. And so you're suffering, you're down on your knees, you're pleading some kind, it just feels like he's on an extended vacation or something. That's the way David felt here. Then he goes on to say in verse 2, he says, "How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily?" David's struggle here was internal. David's biggest enemy was himself. I can't tell you how many times I've counseled people through something, and I have to just say, well, your biggest enemy really is yourself. David's wrestling with some inward stuff. Is this battle going on inside of his head and inside of his heart? His anxiety, his doubts, his fears, his stress, his depression, his confusion. It was this internal struggle of discouragement and disappointments. Now, had God abandoned David? No, he hadn't, but it sure felt that way in this moment. He goes on to say, how long will my enemies be exalted over me? It seems like his enemies are winning. This is believed to be written during the time when he's on the run from Saul, and Saul is the king. Saul setting in the comforts of the palace, and David is sleeping in caves. And what made it worse was that Saul's a horrible guy. I mean, like, David's seeking God, but Saul's not seeking God. He's trying to kill David without cause, even though David has spared his life several times. And doesn't God know all this is happening? Couldn't he do something about it? Had he forgot about David? Of course he had. The Hebrew writer reminds us what God says. He says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Hebrews 13 and verse 5. But God doesn't, it seems like God sometimes forgets about his choice servants. Think about Joseph. It was for 2 years he'd been forgotten after he interpreted the dream of the butler and the baker. He'd been forgotten for 2 years in the dungeon. In fact, it was 13 years from the time he was sold into slavery to the time that he rose to power. You think about other people in the Bible, there's multiple. It seems like Job. It just, or what about Paul? What about David? All of them had these circumstances where it seemed as if God had forgotten about them. And that just, what God was doing during this time was he was developing character in them. There's no instant godliness. Everything in our society, we want it now. But David was anointed as king in his teens, and clearly he had a strong faith. But God put him on the throne at, 29? Like, throughout all those years, what he was doing was developing a man. It seems, though, out of joint in our rush society, but that's how God works sometimes. In verses 3 and 4, look at the petition. Look at David's prayer. He says, consider and hear me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemies say, I have prevailed against him, lest those who trouble me rejoice when I am moved. And so here's David's petition, and David is praying that God will help him. You ever feel overwhelmed, like your suffering's never going to end? What should you do in those moments? Well, you pray, you turn to God. And sometimes we feel so overwhelmed that we struggle to pray, but we shouldn't, because praying is the right thing to do, turning to God, asking for help. Remember, David feels like God has abandoned him, but those are the times that when we need him the most. The real test of faith is when God seems distant. Do you seek him in those moments? Do you turn away from him and turn away from your need for him instead of complaining about God to man, he's complaining about man to God. David is asking God to consider and answer his prayers. Please hear me. Please answer me. Please act. Please intervene here. Enlighten my eyes. Instead of the darkness of the things that I'm seeing, please, I want to see the light. Give me some hope. Give me some encouragement here. And so he's asking God to intervene before he dies at the hands of his enemies. And he's not asking for personal glory here. In fact, notice why he says he doesn't want them to prevail against him. Because they would rejoice. They would say, I have prevailed against him. They would say, ha, we got him. And so could you see, if like this was the time during Saul, how would Saul have felt if he'd actually been able to kill David? If this was a time during Absalom, how would he have felt? He already had a big head. He didn't need any help with it. That's what would have happened. And that's what David fears. Now look at the petition, or look at the praise at the end in verses 6 and 7. In verse 6, he says, but I have trusted in your mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with him. And so David's circumstances have not changed a bit from the beginning of the psalm to the end of the psalm. He still feels confused, depressed, forsaken by God. He's hiding in caves. And Saul is still on the throne and trying to kill him. See, David's circumstances have not changed, but it seems like David's attitude has changed. He's not been delivered yet. If that's true, then why is he praising God now? Well, two things have changed. Number one, David's focus had changed. Think about it. He was focused on himself and his own problems, and he wasn't thinking about God. And there was a shift that moved from the confusion to joy, from depression to praise. Think about it. He complained to God, then he prayed to God, and now he's thinking about God, and he's reminded about what God is capable of as he's praying to ask God for things. And because of that, his reliance is now changed. He went from relying on himself to relying on God because he began to remember all the things that God's done for him in his life. You remember how God delivered him from the lion and the bear, how God delivered him from the giant Goliath, how he delivered him on the battlefield. And why wouldn't he deliver him now? That's the question. Here's the truth. We're kind of like David. We're kind of cripples, and we need a crutch. And yes, God should be our crutch. He's the thing that we should lean on and turn to. And so how about you? Do you see your need? Like, are you willing to admit it? Or are you too proud? You have to see it. You've got to soften your heart. May we, in our times of struggles, turn to God, pray to God, remember God, and praise God, because that's what you see here. I think it's a wonderful psalm. I love it. It's so helpful. And I want to encourage you, if you haven't seen from the beginning, please go back and watch this from the beginning. I think it'll be help to you. And meditate on it. Put it in your heart. I'm thankful that you're here today. Thankful that you've joined the program today. I want to encourage you, if you have any thoughts or any comments or any questions, can I say this, that if you're struggling with anxiety, you're struggling with depression, you're stressed, this is a good psalm for you. Put it in your heart. Think about it. Meditate on it. And be like David. Have your attitude shift and praise God. Thankful that you're on here today. Want to encourage you, again, if you have any thoughts or comments, please comment down below. I'll be able to respond to you, be able to answer your comment, be able to respond back to your question. So appreciate you, and hope everybody has a great rest of their Tuesday. God bless everybody.